Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Yemen Model: Why U.S. Policy Has Failed in the Middle East, by Alexandra Stark. Narrated by Emily Durante. Introduction. The ongoing flow of arms from the U.S. to Saudi Arabia and the UAE is directly contributing to civilian deaths, injuries, and suffering in Yemen. Radia Al-Mutawakkil, chairperson of Muwatina for Human Rights. The missile strike hit a legitimate target, Colonel Turki al-Malki, a spokesman for the Saudi-led coalition, initially claimed. On August 9, 2018, a coalition airstrike hit a bus filled with school-aged children in Saada Governorate in northern Yemen. The strike killed at least 29 civilians, including 21 children. An investigation by CNN and Muwatina for Human Rights, a prominent Yemeni human rights organization, found that the bomb that struck the bus, a Paveway Mk-82, was manufactured by the American company Lockheed Martin. The bomb had been sold to Saudi Arabia with the approval of both the U.S. State Department and Congress. 10 years after President Barack Obama won an election promising to draw back from the Middle East and stop the United States from getting involved in dumb wars, how did a U.S.-made bomb end up killing dozens of Yemeni children? The answer, surprisingly, goes back to that very promise. Prior to March 2015, when the Saudi-led coalition's military intervention in the civil war in Yemen began, U.S. policymakers viewed Yemen through the narrow frame of counterterrorism. U.S. policymakers faced a dilemma. They needed to balance the expansive objective of eradicating al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, while avoiding deploying conventional U.S. forces, which would risk American casualties and a possible quagmire. Instead, U.S. policymakers sought to split the difference by providing counterterrorism support to the personalist autocrat, President Ali Abdullah Saleh, and waging drone and missile strikes against suspected terrorists, strikes that sometimes killed Yemeni civilians, while committing few U.S. forces to the fight on the ground. The Obama administration dubbed this approach to counterterrorism the Yemen model, and advertised its success up until the day before the Saudi-led intervention in Yemen's civil war began. Indeed, the Bush, Obama, and later Trump and Biden administrations, despite their policy differences on a wide range of issues, continued to use this approach in many counterterrorism contexts around the world. While this approach goes by many names, such as by, with, and through, and remote warfare, the idea is the same. Partner with host nation governments to fight terrorist organizations on the ground, while minimizing the risks associated with more direct U.S. involvement. Although the objectives were different, the U.S. approach to the Saudi-led coalition's intervention in Yemen's war was similar. The Obama administration had more important priorities in the region, namely, getting negotiations for the Iran nuclear agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, across the finish line, while maintaining U.S. security partnerships with the Arab Gulf states of the GCC, or Gulf Cooperation Council. The GCC countries opposed the Iran nuclear deal and worried that the United States was withdrawing from the region. When Saudi officials approached the Obama administration to ask for its support for their intervention in Yemen, U.S. officials were not particularly eager to be involved in the war. Nevertheless, they saw supporting the intervention as a necessary exchange to keep GCC security partners on side after the Iran nuclear deal was signed. According to this logic, supporting the intervention would keep the United States from being dragged deeper into regional affairs. Likewise, candidate Donald Trump ran for president in 2016 on a platform that gestured toward the United States leaving the Middle East. Yet, as president, Trump doubled down on the old approach when he came into office. The Trump administration worked to deepen U.S. security partnerships with the GCC via arms sales and gave the coalition a green light to continue its intervention in Yemen. This approach to managing U.S. security priorities in the Middle East has not worked, a fact that the recent history of U.S. engagement in Yemen has demonstrated time and time again. The narrow lens of counterterrorism did not allow U.S. policymakers to see that their partner, the regime of the corrupt autocrat President Ali Abdullah Saleh, was beginning to wobble even before the Arab Spring erupted in 2011. It meant that U.S. officials felt secure pushing forward Yemen's post-Arab Spring political transition process, the National Dialogue Conference, even as the process failed to resolve the underlying issues that generated the Arab Spring protest movement in the first place. And it allowed U.S. officials to believe that they could ultimately stay out of deeper involvement in the war in Yemen by providing logistical support to the intervention. Instead of staying out, the United States became implicated in the conflict and its humanitarian fallout, including the civilian deaths that resulted from coalition airstrikes, such as the 2018 bus bombing. The intervention failed in its objective of containing the Houthis and Iranian influence. Instead, the war in Yemen created a humanitarian disaster, generated further instability in the region, and gave Iran an opportunity to increase its influence on the Arabian Peninsula on Saudi Arabia's southern border. This recent history also demonstrates that while Yemen has long been viewed by U.S. officials as peripheral to U.S. security interests, the United States has been continuously pulled back into wars in Yemen. If the humanitarian suffering is not enough to warrant our concern about Yemen's wars, and it ought to be, then U.S. strategic interests should be. Nor is U.S. engagement in Yemen's war anomalous in how the United States has approached the Middle East more broadly. Rather, U.S. policy in Yemen is part of a broader pattern of U.S. engagement with U.S. security partners and proxy wars in Syria, Libya, and elsewhere across the Middle East. The history of the United States' failures and occasional successes in Yemen throughout the war can therefore provide lessons not just for future U.S. engagement with Yemen, but for the U.S. approach to the Middle East in general. U.S. engagement in Yemen's war is a case study of how the U.S. approach to Middle East proxy wars and security partners has failed. But it can also show us how we can sustainably reform Middle East policy in a way that makes Americans and Yemenis safer and more secure. This book tells the story of U.S. and regional involvement in the ongoing war in Yemen. It explores how Yemen's seemingly successful post-Arab Spring political transition fell apart, how regional actors used proxy war strategies to pursue their own interests via the war in Yemen, and how U.S. logistical and diplomatic support made the Saudi-led coalition's intervention possible. It also shows how U.S. diplomacy could help end the war. Instead of proposing that the United States attempt to impose a peace on Yemen, Lessons Learned explores how U.S. diplomacy can support a peace process and political transition designed and led by Yemenis themselves. The book concludes by drawing on this story to better understand how the United States should reorient its approach to the Middle East to be more just and humane, and to contribute to true security and stability. Lessons Learned. There are three major lessons that emerge from the recent history of U.S. security engagement with Yemen. First, U.S. policy toward Yemen tells us a great deal about U.S. security objectives in the Middle East, and how we must substantially revise the U.S. approach to achieve our policy objectives there. Historically, U.S. policymakers have not approached Yemen through the lens of Yemen itself, but rather as a means to achieve some other security end, whether that was competing with and containing Soviet influence in the Middle East during the Cold War, pushing back against Iran's proxy partnerships across the region while defending U.S. security partners from Iran, or defeating al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Instead of achieving these aims, U.S. policy in Yemen has failed to prevent the outbreak of conflict and contributed to local and regional instability. In short, a focus on security, narrowly defined, leaves all of us less secure. What would an approach built around helping to give Yemenis the tools to build peace and prosperity look like instead? A stable Yemen that has internal and external support for mediation and conflict prevention, provides economic opportunity for its citizens, and strives to improve governance and stamp out corruption would be less likely to succumb to violent conflict, in turn preventing the potential for external military intervention. A stable Yemen would also make U.S. security partners like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, UAE, safer and prevent the regional spillover effects of sub-state violence. A well-governed, prosperous Yemen would be better not just for Yemenis, but also for the wider Middle East and for the United States. A second lesson is about what U.S. foreign policy can accomplish and what it cannot reasonably be expected to achieve. A major thread running through the U.S. approach to Yemen is the question of U.S. leverage. Policymakers and researchers have long debated whether and under what conditions the United States can use leverage with its allies and partners, such as arms sales and other kinds of security assistance, to affect those partners' behavior. This debate became evident in the news, for example, in October 2018, after the Saudi journalist and U.S. resident Jamal Khashoggi was brutally murdered, and a United Nations investigation determined that senior Saudi officials were responsible. Some U.S. policymakers, commentators, and activists argued that the United States should substantially revise, if not completely sever, its relationship with Saudi Arabia and its de facto ruler, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, in the wake of the murder. Others countered that to do so would risk losing potential future U.S. leverage with the kingdom. Congress moved ahead to pass legislation blocking arms sales to the kingdom and ending U.S. support for the Saudi-led intervention in Yemen, all in an attempt to force Saudi Arabia to pare down the civilian casualties associated with its campaign of airstrikes, open ports and airports to commerce, and eventually withdraw from Yemen altogether. Critics contended that Congress's actions did not matter all that much. Yet both historically and more recently, during the current conflict, U.S. policymakers have successfully used U.S. leverage on a number of occasions to affect the behavior of external states that have militarily intervened in Yemen. During the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations, U.S. policymakers sometimes used U.S. leverage over the coalition to achieve relatively small but still significant shifts in the coalition's behavior, while at other times, for a variety of reasons, they declined to do so. Evidence in each case shows that U.S. leverage does matter. When the United States chose to exert leverage, it was able to shape how the intervening coalition behaved in Yemen. Understanding what U.S. leverage vis-à-vis its partners in the region can accomplish, and the limits of that leverage, can help us understand what we can expect U.S. policy in the Middle East to actually achieve, so we can calibrate our approach accordingly. Finally, this book explores how we can change the U.S. approach to the Middle East to align U.S. policy goals with the tools we have to achieve them. Even in the absence of elite political will, democratic engagement can change U.S. security policy. The U.S. national security arena has long been dominated by gatekeeping forces who insist that people without a specific expertise are not qualified to weigh in on such existential and complex issues. This has created a resistance to change within the U.S. national security community, as well as a suspicion of anyone deemed an outsider, including activists and even sometimes the American people themselves. Yet this is not how we treat domestic U.S. policy issues, and it is not how we ought to approach security policy either. Democratic engagement on any U.S. policy issue, whether in the foreign or domestic policy realm, should be seen as inherently valuable to policymaking, not as an impediment to good policy. The domestic politics of U.S. engagement with Yemen's war provides potent lessons for how we might reform U.S. security policy in the Middle East and the United States' approach to the world more broadly. From 2017 through 2020, U.S. support for the war in Yemen became a surprising rallying cry for Americans to express their discontent with the United States' endless wars. Stymied by the Trump White House, which prioritized U.S. relationships with Saudi Arabia and other security partners over any other goals, a scrappy group of advocates in Washington, D.C., a national network of grassroots activists, and a handful of members of Congress who cared deeply about the issue, working alongside institutions as ideologically diverse as the Charles Koch Institute and the Open Society Foundations, managed to shift the political conversation about the stakes of U.S. involvement in the war in Yemen. Both of the bills that passed Congress, one that would block arms sales and another that would end U.S. support for the war, were ultimately vetoed by President Trump. Nevertheless, pressure from Congress and advocates still created distinct changes in the U.S. approach to the war. The United States ended its aerial refueling support to the coalition in late 2018, and by engaging the American public and a wider array of policymakers, the legislation created pressure for Saudi Arabia and the UAE to acknowledge that a military victory was out of reach and to engage in ceasefire negotiations. When President Joe Biden came into office in 2021, he announced an end to U.S. offensive support for the coalition. The Yemen Advocacy Coalition in the United States and 3 presidential administrations' responses to pressure from Congress over Yemen can teach us a great deal about how we can change U.S. Middle East policy. 2 caveats. There are 2 important caveats about what the book does not cover. First, it does not provide a comprehensive history of the war in Yemen. As Paul Dresch has written, all who write on Yemen feel we oversimplify. I've instead chosen to focus on the most relevant events, dynamics, and parties to the conflict, while inevitably leaving things out due to limits in the scope of the book. Chapter 2 in particular, which covers the history of wars and many of the political dynamics in Yemen over the second half of the 20th and the early 21st century, necessarily skims over a lot of important history in a relatively short space, while Chapter 6 seeks to provide a short but comprehensive overview of the dynamics of the war itself between 2015 and 2021. Throughout the book, citations provide additional resources on other aspects of Yemen's history. There are a number of scholars working today who have produced excellent resources on various aspects of this history, as well as the ongoing war, many, but not all of whom, are cited throughout the book. Second, again because of its scope, the book is focused on U.S. policy in Yemen's war specifically. There is a certain irony in framing a book around the United States when I believe that too much attention has been given to the role of the United States in the Middle East in Western research and media, and not enough to local actors, especially Yemenis themselves. The framing of the book is not meant to take away from the agency and autonomy of Yemenis. Rather, my aim is to understand how U.S. policy can contribute to better outcomes for Yemenis and for Americans, and where it has gone wrong. Methods. In the course of my research, I conducted more than 60 interviews, both on and off the record, with current and former officials, advocates, congressional staffers, and other experts on Yemen and U.S. foreign policy. Other primary source material consulted includes public statements from leaders like Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, and the UAE's President Mohammed bin Zayed, MBZ, and other senior officials. U.S. officials' memoirs, newspaper reporting from U.S. and Gulf sources, all translations from Arabic are my own, including statements from officials that I was often able to corroborate and expand on in my interviews, testimony before Congress from policymakers and experts, congressional legislation, and archival research at the John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Libraries, the Kew National Archives in the United Kingdom, the Crest Archive, the CIA Records Search Tool, and the Foreign Relations of the United States, FRUS series. I also consulted a wide range of secondary sources, including books by scholars and journalists, and reports from key organizations, including ACAPS, Amnesty International, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLED, the Congressional Research Service, Human Rights Watch, the International Crisis Group, Muatana for Human Rights, RAND, the Sanaa Center for Strategic Studies, the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, the UN Yemen Panel of Experts, the Yemen Data Project, the Yemen Peace Project, and the Yemen Policy Center. The book draws on the research I conducted for my PhD dissertation at Georgetown University, as well as my subsequent research at New America, a think tank in Washington, D.C., where I have had numerous conversations with officials, journalists, experts, advocates, aid workers, artists, academics, and others. Chapter 1. A Brief History of External Intervention in Yemen's Wars. This peanut war will be with us a long time yet. Robert Comer, senior official in the Kennedy administration on the civil war in North Yemen. North and South Yemen existed as separate political entities for centuries. Indeed, in recent history, Yemen was a united polity only between 1990 through the Houthi coup in 2014. Even in that brief period of unity, Yemen experienced substantial internal instability, including a secessionist civil war in 1994, 6 rounds of fighting between the Houthis and the central government throughout the early 2000s, and a southern separatist protest movement beginning in 2004, among other violent and peaceful efforts to contest the legitimacy of the central state. When both North and South Yemen became independent states in the 1960s, the United States viewed Yemen as largely peripheral to its immediate security interests. While successive U.S. administrations saw their role in the Middle East as increasingly important to U.S. national security, from the perspective of U.S. policymakers, conflicts in Yemen remained proxies for broader regional and global rivalries. This chapter briefly explores the history of conflict and external military intervention in Yemen since the 1960s. Yemen divided. In A History of Modern Yemen, Paul Dresch writes that the idea of a unified Yemeni state emerged in the 20th century in a context shaped by outside powers. Throughout the 19th century, political structures across Yemen were defined by reference to religion or dynasty, not territory, with rulers' claims overlapping in both time and space. Much of the political history of Yemen in the 20th century revolves around the idea of a single central state, although this unified state did not emerge until 1990. Throughout Yemen's history, power-hungry outsiders have always lusted after Yemen's strategic location, for whoever controls its western seaboard controls the entrance to the Red Sea, Tim McIntosh Smith writes. The British colonized southern Yemen in 1839 when they began to occupy the southern port city of Aden and gradually extended indirect control over Aden's hinterland. The port itself was strategically important to the maritime power since it served as a stop to refuel steamships on the journey between Suez and Bombay. As a result, Aden grew into a large cosmopolitan city. The British formed a system of indirect rule via alliances with local sultans that became the protectorates of South Arabia. By 1958, Aden was one of the world's busiest ports, serving as a point of connection for global commerce and Britain's imperial strategy in the Middle East and beyond. The hinterland outside of Aden, however, primarily served the British colonizers as a buffer between the port city and the Ottoman-occupied north, and was largely neglected by its colonizers. In northern Yemen, Ottoman conquest of territory in Yemen began in the 16th century. The territorial scope of Ottoman territory in Yemen expanded and contracted over the ensuing centuries, before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. By 1904, most parts of northern Yemen outside of major cities fell under the authority of Imam Yahya, whose family had ruled locally for almost 1,000 years. After the Ottoman departure, Imam Yahya expanded the imamete's influence southward. By 1934, Imam Yahya had control over much of Yemen's territory outside of British-held Aden. North Yemen, the Yemen Arab Republic, YAR. The North-South territorial division persisted through much of the 20th century. In North Yemen, a 1962 coup by revolutionary military officers led by Abdullah Salal and backed by Egypt's president Gamal Abdel Nasser, deposed Imam Yahya's son, Imam al-Badr, and established the Yemen Arab Republic, YAR. Following the coup, Imam al-Badr and a group of supporters were able to flee across the border to Saudi Arabia and conducted an insurgent war, backed by Saudi Arabia and with the support of other monarchies in the region, that lasted until 1970. The civil war in North Yemen became an arena for regional and global rivalries. While it began as a localized conflict over control of the Yemeni state, the 1962 civil war became a battleground in the competition for regional hegemony between Egypt's President Nasser and his revolutionary socialist pan-Arab allies, on the one hand, and Saudi Arabia and its coalition of conservative monarchies, on the other, part of a broader ideological conflict that Malcolm Kerr has termed the Arab Cold War. Dana Schmidt, a journalist who reported from Yemen during the war, wrote that the war in Yemen has been fought only partly because of Yemen. More of the struggle has been due to the rivalry between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. What otherwise might have remained a localized dispute instead became a regional proxy war that lasted more than 7 years and threatened to draw the United States and Soviet Union into a direct confrontation at a time when Cold War tensions were at a peak. Egypt ultimately deployed more than half of its total ground forces, up to 70,000 troops, to Yemen at points during the conflict. Nasser later referred to the intervention as "My Vietnam," in recognition of its high cost to Egypt and the failure of Nasser's nation-building efforts in the YAR. The conflict also saw one of the first large-scale documented uses of chemical weapons since World War I. Salal's forces were inspired by Nasser's revolutionary Free Officers movement, and Salal's coalition, known as the Republicans, was made up of fellow army officers as well as members of the southern Shafi tribes, disaffected northern Zaydi tribes, and merchants. Al-Badr's forces, the Royalists, included many of the northern Zaydi tribes, as well as Yemenis who opposed Egyptian interference in Yemen. Within a week of the coup, the United Arab Republic, UAR, the official name for Egypt at the time, had deployed troops and supplies to support the new regime, called the Yemen Arab Republic, and its Republican forces, while Saudi Arabia and Jordan provided funding and diplomatic support for the Royalists. Britain also provided the royalists with covert support. Saudi Arabia and its fellow Middle Eastern conservative monarchies, on the other hand, provided funding and support to the royalists and the displaced imam. The
Sample complete. Ready to continue?